Have you ever heard of the forbidden fragment, a vision never published in the newspapers? Imagine for a moment a page torn from time, a snippet of testimony circulated in whispers among pilgrims and researchers, but kept out of the headlines. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This fragment is linked to the unrevealed messages of Medjugorje, a set of warnings and instructions that many say carry an urgent, even prophetic tone. When I say vision, I don't just mean fleeting images or personal sensations. I mean an experience described in such vivid detail that the reader feels the chill of dawn, the light cutting through clouds, and the sensation of an inner calling. There are accounts of visionaries in prayer, of a presence asking for profound conversion, of signs that haven't been widely reported by the media. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt an intuition so strong it felt like an insistent voice saying, "Wake up"? This is the atmosphere surrounding this forbidden fragment. In the next few minutes, I'll take you on a journey that blends history, prophecy, and mystery. We'll explore Medjugorje, its apparitions, its visionaries, and especially these unrevealed messages that raise uncomfortable questions. I'm not here to impose truths, but to present stories, raise hypotheses, and show why so many people believe there's something more, something that's been carefully filtered or simply ignored by mainstream media outlets. And yes, there will be controversy. Some will say these are clear signs, others will urge caution and discernment. The important thing is that you understand the weight of these words and why they're disturbing. Consider the scene: an ancient church in the background, the camera zooming in on a yellowed manuscript, words underlined as if someone had tried to insist on what the world would rather forget. The language of the messages touches on central themes: prayer, fasting, the centrality of the Eucharist, family, but also includes warnings that sound like invitations to spiritual vigilance. These aren't just isolated beliefs, they're a call that for many calls for practical change in daily life. The forbidden fragment, according to some testimonies, conveys such a powerful image that it wasn't easily absorbed by institutions and the media. Throughout this introduction, I will sow questions that I will address later. Who had access to the original text? Why were certain passages omitted or not covered in the newspapers? Are there vested interests behind the silence, or is it pastoral prudence? These questions are not mere speculation. They are at the root of why the unrevealed messages continue to spark debate among theologians, pilgrims, and scholars of contemporary spirituality. And I want to hear from you. Which of these questions intrigues you most? Comment below as we watch, because your opinion may guide the next phase of this investigation. In this video, we won't just recite ancient words. We'll reflect on the impact these prophecies and warnings can have on real life, your life. How would we respond if a spiritual warning called for a radical change in priorities, prayer, and community? Are we prepared to hear such a call? The tone here is investigative, but also intimate. This is an invitation for each of us to examine our own hearts in light of the messages circulating in Medjugorje. Get ready for images that reconstruct the vision, testimonies that defend and question it, and an analysis of the 7 unrevealed messages that promises to be direct and accessible. Don't close your eyes now. The forbidden fragment begins to take shape, and the next segment will delve into the content of this vision that didn't appear in the newspapers, revealing words, symbols, and a possible reason for the silence that surrounded it all. And as we delve deeper into this search, I want to ask you something sincerely. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most. If you've experienced something similar, if you know someone who has heard of these unrevealed messages from Medjugorje, or simply what question you'd like me to answer next, Your voice transforms this investigation into something alive, and reading your stories helps shape each upcoming episode. If you found this excerpt intriguing and want to see more reconstructions, analyses, and testimonies that better explain what we call the forbidden fragment, please like the video so YouTube understands that this type of content deserves to reach others who also seek signs and discernment. A like is simple, but it makes a real difference in our ability to pursue deeper research. And if you want to follow the entire series, see the documents, hear the voices in favor and those in criticism, and participate in the decisions about which archives to investigate first, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription shows that there's a community interested in more than just gossip, a community that wants to reflect, pray, and prepare seriously. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. And the more people share experiences, the richer and more responsible the conversation becomes. So comment, like, and subscribe, not as an empty request, but as an invitation to walk together in this discovery, because the next part will reveal details of the fragment that many people have never had the chance to read, and the reactions of those who were closest to this vision. The central idea behind the so-called unrevealed messages is simple and, at the same time, disturbing. They are 7 instructions and warnings attributed to the apparitions in Medjugorje, which have not gained the same public circulation as the better-known messages. According to reports from visionaries and researchers, they contain a more urgent and practical tone, a call for personal conversion, a change of mindset, and decisions that impact daily life. These are not empty theories or cheap sensationalism. Many who bring these voices to light do so with the intention of preserving a spiritual journey that, in their view, could bring about real transformation in communities and families. It is important to emphasize that there is controversy. Some see this material as a hidden truth of great value, while others recommend extreme caution, calling for verification, context, and discernment before giving credence to any fragment. Still, the very existence of the debate reveals something essential about the phenomenon. It touches on the background, on different ways of interpreting revelations, and on how a spiritual message finds space, or not, in the public sphere. When we delve deeper into the descriptions of these accounts, we realize that the words used are not generic. They are charged with images and commands that touch on concrete issues, intense invitations to constant prayer, calls to the centrality of the Eucharist as a source of renewal, recommendations for restructuring family life, guidance on fasting and penance, and warnings about signs that could precede times of trial. In several passages, references appear to internal changes that must occur before any external transformation, a renewed mindset, a discipline of prayer that translates into daily actions, small decisions that together produce a profound impact on the community. For those on a sincere spiritual quest, this combination of symbolic language and practical instructions creates a sense of urgency. It's not just knowing, it's acting. At the same time, there are reports of passages that sound exceptional, prophetic, images, symbols that refer to universal events. And this is where the controversy intensifies. Some researchers suggest that certain passages were filtered or softened to prevent unnecessary alarm or apocalyptic interpretations that would confuse rather than help. Others claim that elements were purposefully withheld out of pastoral prudence, so that faith would not be manipulated by sensationalist curiosity. And there are still those who point to institutional and media interests, a text that challenges established narratives or demands changes in the mindset of religious leaders. And believers can be uncomfortable for those controlling the public agenda. These hypotheses, however divergent they may seem, form the backstage of what we call hidden truth, spaces where the spiritual interacts with the human, where revelation meets the institution, and where each believer's journey can be influenced by decisions made away from the public eye. On a more intimate level, the messages, at least according to those who study and transmit them, seek to awaken a response that goes beyond intellectual curiosity. They are invitations that test the coherence between belief and practice. In other words, the transformation they propose is not merely theoretical, it demands concrete choices. Those who read or listen to these fragments are confronted with practical questions about prayer routines, family priorities, spiritual consumption habits, and time dedicated to community. Therefore, to say that this is just another vision would be to underestimate the potential reach of these warnings. The narrative present in the unrevealed messages points to personal decisions that, if made by many, could reshape the spiritual landscape of entire communities. It's natural, given this, that doubts arise about the provenance and authenticity of these texts. Discerning what is genuine and what may be a biased interpretation requires care, analysis of sources, collation of testimonies, comparison with official documents, and, above all, pastoral prudence. However, it's also true that prolonged silence on certain passages fuels speculation and increases the fascination with what has been omitted. There is therefore a constant tension between the transparency desired by many believers and the caution exercised by others. This tension is part of the scenario in which the 7 unrevealed messages remain alive in the imagination of those seeking signs and answers. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and in doing so, it's important to remember that discussing unrevealed messages isn't just about rummaging through ancient documents. It's about examining the impact these words have when they reach the hands of ordinary people, mothers, fathers, young people, community leaders who face their daily routines and must make decisions that shape their homes and destinies. Some passages speak of practices that seem simple but require discipline, setting aside time for family prayer, resuming sacramental participation, establishing moments of silence and fasting that foster inner listening. Other, more symbolic passages emerge as powerful images that call for attentive interpreters, signs in the heavens, times of trial, invitations to spiritual vigilance. Reactions to these elements vary. Some find comfort and direction, and others feel uneasy. For every prophecy challenges the comforts of everyday life and proposes a new order of priorities. By exploring these fragments, we also recognize the role of cultural and historical context. A message received in times of uncertainty takes on different nuances than the same words spoken in times of stability. Therefore, reading requires sensitivity to understand not only what is said, but to whom and under what circumstances. The transformation sought is not automatic. It requires a journey of interpretation and application. And this journey, when shared, can reveal fascinating behind-the-scenes stories, conversations between visionaries and pastors, documents archived in unexpected places, reactions from communities that have lived through unique experiences. All of this forms a fabric of revelations that, even fragmented, offers clues about intentions and responsibilities. As we continue to unravel, it's worth asking, how do these messages shape our view of practical faith, community responsibility, and the hidden truth that circulates among accounts and documents? How do we balance the legitimate desire for transparency with the need for discernment? These questions don't have easy answers, but they spark an essential movement, that of placing spirituality in dialogue with reality without losing the tenderness or seriousness the subject requires. Comment: that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and to understand the weight of these unrevealed messages, we must return to the scene where it all began. Medjugorje, a small village in the Balkans that on June 24, 1981, became the center of an experience that changed the lives of many. That day, 6 young people, ordinary teenagers with simple routines and very modest families, began reporting apparitions and words emerging from the silence of prayer. Among them were names that have now become references for those researching. The phenomenon: Mirjana, Vika, Ivan, Maria, and Yakov. These faces, previously anonymous, came to be seen by pilgrims as bearers of a calling that blended tenderness and urgency, and it was this combination that made the news escape local borders and travel the world. The very geography of Medjugorje, with its steep hills and modest churches, contributed to creating an almost cinematic setting. The apparition occurred between simple life and a profound sense of transcendence, and this tension between the everyday and the sacred fueled global curiosity. Global attention didn't fall from the sky by chance. Reports of unexpected healings, intense personal conversions, groups of pilgrims returning, transformed to their hometowns. All of this created a ripple effect. People on a spiritual quest found narratives that spoke to their pain and longings. Pastors and scholars began observing the apparitions and testing hypotheses. The media, in turn, oscillated between sensationalist coverage and more sober attempts to explain the phenomenon. Soon, Medjugorje ceased to be just a dot on the map and began to occupy a place in the conversations of those seeking signs and answers. It's important to remember that in that context, the region was part of the former Yugoslavia, a time of tensions that also colored interpretations and concerns about any collective religious event. This social and historical backdrop forms an essential backdrop for understanding what came next, both the expressions of faith and the suspicions and resistance that surrounded the movement. The protagonists were, at first glance, young people, living like any other villagers, but their experiences awakened something beyond the personal, a collective narrative of transformation. Thousands of pilgrims have stated that upon arriving there, they changed their mindset about prayer, family, and everyday decisions. For many, Medjugorje came to represent a kind of spiritual laboratory where disciplined practices, fasting, family prayer, frequent confession, were tested with the promise of a real impact on their lives. This promise in turn fueled the circulation of documents, reports, and yes, fragments that circulated among small groups before gaining any form of widespread dissemination. It is in this movement between the intimate and the public that the so-called unrevealed messages are born, texts or excerpts that for various reasons were not included in the most widely publicized compilations, but which continued to be cited behind the scenes by those who closely followed them. The profile of the visionaries also lends credibility to the account for those seeking to understand and ponder it seriously. These are not charismatic leaders with established public agendas, but witnesses who in many cases reported simple lifestyles and a common prayer routine. This contrast between the ordinary nature of the messengers and the intensity of the words attributed to them helps explain why many researchers and theologians have chosen to study the phenomenon carefully. There is a call for authenticity, a need to verify sources and contexts, and a prudence in separating genuine revelation from hasty interpretations. Therefore, when discussing Medjugorje and the messages that circulate without much publicity, it is legitimate to call for a dual attitude: openness to the possibility of revelation and a careful examination of the documents and testimonies. The initial revelations brought themes that resonate at any time: a call for conversion, attention to sacramental life, care for the family, and a call for spiritual vigilance. But among these more familiar themes, there are passages that sound more insistent, with images and instructions that seem to call for immediate practical changes. It is precisely this practical tone that leads some accounts to be classified as unrevealed, points that, according to some interpreters, were softened, filtered, or simply not given headlines. The phenomenon of filtering is not exclusive to the religious field. In any grand narrative that challenges established structures, whether in politics, science, or culture, there are decisions about what to make public and what to keep under scrutiny. In the case of Medjugorje, these decisions involved local authorities, independent researchers, and, of course, the very audience that consumed the stories. Looking at the dates, names, and sequence of events, we perceive a trajectory that blends devotion and investigation. Beginning in 1981, distinct versions of the facts emerged. Devout audiences reporting transformative experiences, critics urging caution and method, scholars seeking documents and interviews, and a market for narratives that at times strained the boundaries between authentic faith and spectacle. This diversity of voices transformed history into a living thing, subject to revision and recontextualization. Therefore, to say that the unrevealed messages have only one meaning is an oversimplification. They are rather fragments within a larger tapestry, and each fragment can point to shifts in mindset, personal decisions, or even a larger community. Impact, depending on how it is interpreted and applied. When we consider the practical impact, the discussion ceases to be merely historical and becomes pastoral. How to apply guidance that calls for conversion without generating panic. How to balance transparency and prudence. How we respond to these questions reveals much about our own faith journey and the collective responsibility of those who disseminate and those who receive a message. There is therefore an ethical dimension to the circulation of revelations. It is not enough to have access to a fragment. A process of interpretation is required that respects contexts, lives, and what each community can truly embrace as a transformative practice. This is one of the reasons why conversations about Medjugorje remain so heated and nuanced. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and as we continue exploring stories, documents, and testimonies, we will seek to understand not only what was said, but how these words circulate among real people, mothers who decide to change, their prayer routines, young people who rethink their priorities, leaders facing complex decisions about community care. The journey that unfolds before us is both one of investigation and transformation, inviting us to approach the revelations with a balance of hope and discernment. Comment: this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and to understand why certain passages were labeled unrevealed. We need to look closely at three mechanisms that frequently appear behind the scenes of any major narrative: media censorship, ecclesiastical prudence, and filtering by local leaders. Each of these factors has its own logic, different effects on the circulation of information, and a direct impact on how the hidden truth ends up being perceived by the public. Let's start with media censorship. I'm not suggesting an abstract conspiracy here, but something more subtle and concrete. A combination of editorial criteria, attention economy, and institutional pressures that determine what makes headlines and what stays in the drawers. Newspapers and broadcasters work with intense curation. Editorial decisions are made based on audience ratings, the risk of lawsuits, political sensitivity, and even editorial lines that prefer to avoid stories that could inflame an already polarized public. When a fragment contains prophetic imagery or radical-sounding recommendations, editors may choose not to publish it to avoid creating alarms or controversies that would require time and resources to contextualize. This type of censorship isn't necessarily malicious. Sometimes it stems from the premise of protecting the public from apocalyptic interpretations. Other times, it responds to interests that favor safer, more lucrative narratives. The practical effect is that many accounts remain confined to smaller circles. pamphlets, parish bulletins, or conversations among pilgrims, and gradually gain an aura of secrecy simply through the lack of widespread exposure. Next comes ecclesiastical prudence, an element rooted in the Church's institutional tradition and the pastoral responsibility it assumes. For religious authorities, any claim of private revelation requires careful analysis, verifying doctrinal coherence, evaluating spiritual fruits, and above all, protecting communities from excesses that could generate confusion. Prudence here has two complementary facets. On the one hand, it is a legitimate precaution to prevent poorly verified claims from causing spiritual or social harm. On the other, it can mean withholding certain content until a more solid discernment is reached. Authorities may request temporary silence on passages they consider difficult to interpret, or recommend gradual disclosure to avoid misunderstandings. This pastoral attitude, while often motivated by goodwill, also contributes to the public's perception that something is being hidden. When an institution adopts caution, the information vacuum tends to be filled by speculation, and the truth, even if complete, risks being viewed with suspicion by the community that expects transparency. The third, equally important mechanism is filtering by local leaders, a process that involves everyone from the parish's own clergy to community workers and researchers who straddle the sacred and secular realms. These leaders operate a fine line, caring for the faith of their flock, maintaining social order, and simultaneously managing the flow of visitors, books, and recordings arriving in the region. In many cases, they are the ones who decide which documents will be circulated among pilgrims, which accounts will be recorded in archives, and which will be recommended for further study. Filtering can occur for practical reasons: avoiding panic, protecting the integrity of visionaries, preserving local traditions, but also for strategic reasons, when there is a fear that certain messages may divert attention from essential spiritual practices or provoke internal ruptures. Thus, fragments that for some represent urgent revelations may, for others, be elements that compromise pastoral unity or community security. The consequence is that the circulation of information occurs through selective channels, and the external public begins to receive versions already mediated by those close to the seers or the archives. These three reasons, media censorship, ecclesiastical prudence, and local filtering, are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they often intertwine, forming a complex network that regulates the flow of revelations. Imagine, for example, a passage containing symbolic imagery about future trials. An editor considers it incendiary, an authority urges prudence, and a local leader decides to keep the text in circulation only among trusted groups. The result is that the fragment becomes an enigma, circulating in different versions and generating debates about authenticity, intention, and meaning. At this point, intellectual curiosity must go hand in hand with healthy doubt. Investigating, without turning every hypothesis into dogma, evaluating sources without distrusting everything, seeking evidence without losing sight of the pastoral impact that inadequate dissemination can have. There's another element to consider when thinking about hidden truth: the ambiguity inherent in prophetic content. Texts with symbolic language or meaningful imagery can yield multiple interpretations, and this interpretive flexibility makes it easier for different groups with diverse mindsets and agendas to select excerpts according to their needs. Thus, fragments end up serving as a mirror for the hopes and fears of those who read them, and this dynamic of projection makes it even more difficult to decide what should be widely disseminated and what should remain under review. In terms of impact, the choice to make certain content public or not can change pastoral decisions, guide community practices, and even influence personal faith trajectories. Therefore, the transparency demanded by many clashes with the responsibility of those who hold the material. By observing these mechanisms closely, we realize that the issue isn't simply a matter of hiding or revealing, it's a complex interplay of responsibilities, risks, and consequences. The journey of those seeking to understand the hidden messages therefore requires method and sensitivity. Cross-referencing sources, interviews with those at the center of the events, historical analysis, and above all, a keen eye on the human impact. Only then can we get closer to what truly matters. Not just fact-checking, but discernment about how these words can transform mindsets, guide decisions, and generate a real impact on people's lives. Now I want to delve even deeper into this. Subject. Comment. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. And according to some accounts circulating among pilgrims and researchers, the forbidden fragment opens like an almost cinematic vision, a scene that begins with a heavy, almost palpable silence, as if the surrounding air had been stretched until it became a thin, translucent fabric. Some claim that the first image is that of a light that is not just clarity, but presence, a luminosity that pierces dark clouds, tears through the mist, and casts long shadows on ancient stones. At that moment, they describe, there is a scent, difficult to name, a mixture of wet earth and ancient incense, something capable of awakening ancestral memories in those who hear the story. The vision, according to these testimonies, is not limited to words. It brings sensations, the chill that runs down the spine, the accelerated beating of the heart, the metallic taste of urgency in the mouth of those who witness it. At the center of the scene appears a figure that many prefer not to label with dogmatic certainties. Some accounts speak of a feminine presence shrouded in simplicity, others describe symbols that refer to the Eucharist and family, and there are even passages that mention more enigmatic signs, lights in the sky, a late harvest symbolizing times of trial, and a call to inner vigilance. The tone, according to the account, is simultaneously tender and cutting. Guidance for reconciliation and prayer is delivered with the same firmness as warnings that incite a change of mind and decision. Those who recount these details often use words like invitation and call, but they also convey a moral weight, as if the vision carried a concrete responsibility. It is not enough to admire the flame. It is necessary to burn away what impedes the growth of good in each heart. Among the fragments cited, there are images that remain in the memory of those who heard them. A simple table set for the family, with broken bread and joined hands. A lit candle that does not go out even in a strong wind. Figures of children running toward a field that, according to some, symbolizes a new harvest of faith. Other passages are more stark. References to times of testing, where choices will be important. Warnings about the need to be wary of moral disorder and the erosion of tradition. Everything is narrated in symbolic language, but with such vivid details that some swear they felt, even from a distance, the warmth of a promise and the chill of a warning. These relics of words often circulate accompanied by small variations. Verb changed here, a detail of scenery there, and this variation fuels both fascination and caution among scholars. It's important to emphasize that, according to some researchers who compile testimonies and textual comparisons, the very fragmentary nature of the account suggests that the original text underwent cuts or adaptations over time. There are indications, they say, that more complete versions existed in private records, in notebooks kept by pilgrims' families, or in letters exchanged between visionaries and spiritual advisors. In other cases, there are oral accounts circulating among devotees that were never officially transcribed. This mode of circulation, part manuscript, part oral, part memoir, contributes to the aura of mystery. The forbidden fragment is not just a hidden phrase. It is a mosaic of memories that needs to be stitched together to reveal a larger pattern. Emotionally, many who share these stories describe a transformative experience, spontaneous tears while reading, a desire for immediate change in relationships, making decisions regarding daily prayer or family organization, small acts of penance that become solid routines. The text's power, they say, lies not only in its novelty, but in its ability to provoke concrete transformation, changing habits, prioritizing what is considered essential, and revising one's mindset. This practical impact explains why, for some, the fragment's restricted circulation is seen as a detriment. If such words could guide beneficial personal decisions, why not make them accessible to more people? However, and it must be emphasized, there are also those who approach this material with reservations. Theologians and pastors who follow oral histories warn of the danger of literal readings of symbols that require interpretation, noting that prophetic language often speaks in images that lend themselves to multiple applications. Some highlight the risk of readings that foster a mindset of fear rather than encouraging a calm and responsible conversion. In this field of tension, the forbidden fragment functions as a mirror. It reflects projections of hope and simultaneously human anxieties. The question that arises is less about the existence of something extraordinary than about how this experience is received and translated into community practice. By considering the sensory descriptions, the light piercing the clouds, the smell of earth and incense, the taste of urgency, we can understand why so many accounts evoke immediate emotion. The experience is not merely cognitive, it is bodily, affective, existential. For many, this sensory dimension is precisely what gives the text its internal authority. It is not just what is said, but how it touches the recipient's body and soul. At the same time, this same emotional charge demands discernment. Intense emotions do not automatically guarantee veracity, which is why careful analysis of sources and contexts is once again indispensable. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, bringing to light not just the images, but the possible practical implications of heeding such warnings. What kind of routine change would a community accept? What family decisions would be re-evaluated? How to balance hope and prudence in the face of a vision that, according to some reports, mixes tenderness and severity? These questions invite us to walk behind the scenes, where documents, testimonies, and small decisions intersect to form a living story, subject to revision and revelation. Comment? That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the core of the 7 unrevealed messages requires us to calmly examine each thread of this fabric, perceiving not only what each passage says, but also what kind of transformation it seeks to provoke in the mindset of those who receive it. The first thread, according to reports circulating among those who have studied the documents and heard testimonies, speaks of conversion, not the superficial conversion of fine words, but a call for a radical change of heart. The central idea of this passage is a persistent invitation to rethink priorities, to abandon habits that drain faith, and to embrace practices that rebuild intimacy with God and with others. The question these accounts pose in the reader's soul is direct and cutting. What decisions are you postponing today that, if made now, would transform your routine and your family? This is a provocation that connects with real life. Conversion as an impulse for concrete decisions, not a fleeting feeling. The second thread that emerges in the compilations is the emphasis on prayer, presented not as an occasional ritual, but as a discipline that builds character. In the accounts, prayer is described as the bridge and matrix for all other changes, a habit that shapes mindset and guides daily decisions. The message, at its core, suggests simple yet systematic practices: family prayer, personal prayer in remembrance, moments of silence that allow for listening more than speaking. And then comes the question that pricks the conscience. Do you have real space in your routine to be silent and listen, or is your life so busy that spirituality has become just another item on the to-do list? Next, many of the fragments allude to the family as a sacred place for the formation and transmission of faith. Family appears in the narratives as a set table, dialogue, and practical forgiveness, elements that underpin any project of community transformation. The tone is pastoral and at the same time urgent. Caring for the family is caring for the future. Small decisions in the home reverberate across generations. The question that arises is practical and uncomfortable. What priority does your home have in its actions today? Dining together, praying together, intentional presence? Or does your family live fragmented among routines that don't intersect? The fourth message, according to the versions that reached independent scholars, places the Eucharist at the center of life as a source of renewal. This is not an abstract theological discourse, but a call to sacramental participation that transforms attitude and action. The Eucharist is presented as nourishment that sustains correct decisions and as a reference for a community that desires to be truly supportive. The provocative question this account raises is practical. Does your spiritual life find its source in something that nourishes your moral and emotional coherence, or is your religious practice disconnected from your daily conduct? Next comes the topic of fasting and penance, not as an exercise in masochism, but as a discipline that liberates and clarifies the mind. In the accounts, fasting is a tool for reordering desires, slowing down the pace, and making room to hear what's essential. It is, in short, an intentional decision that generates impact. The question that accompanies this theme is provocative. What habits could you reduce today to make room for listening and generosity? The question invites us to rethink consumption patterns and the pace of life as part of spiritual transformation. Spiritual vigilance ranks sixth in the narratives, paying attention to signs, being wary of distractions, and being ready to act coherently when circumstances demand it. Here, the message doesn't serve as a facile warning, but rather as an invitation to a posture of serene readiness, to the formation of a mindset that doesn't allow itself to be paralyzed by fear or laziness. The question that remains is both practical and ethical. Are you attentive to what erodes faith in your community, or have you allowed indifference to become the norm? Finally, the accounts allude to a prophetic warning that, in different versions, appears as a warning about times of trial or social transformation. This warning need not necessarily be read in apocalyptic terms. Many interpreters suggest it is a call to responsibility, to prepare the heart and the community to respond with charity, sacrifice, and wisdom. The final provocation is existential. In the face of potential trials, which mindset do you want to cultivate? One of panic and division, or one of humble courage and service? By interweaving these 7 threads, conversion, prayer, family, Eucharist, fasting, vigilance, and prophetic warning, the messages, according to those who preserve them, form a spiritual ecosystem. Each element feeds the other. Prayer strengthens. Conversion. Family is a field of practice. The Eucharist provides sustenance. Fasting clarifies desires. Vigilance fosters readiness. And prophetic warning guides collective attitudes. This systemic logic is part of the fascination and also part of the complexity. Accepting one's part implies redesigning one's routine, mindset, and decisions. And that is why, for many, these messages have the potential for real transformation, not just a change in discourse, but in habits, relationships, and priorities. At the same time, it's necessary to maintain a critical and methodological distance. Interpreting these themes requires cross-referencing sources, contextual analysis, and sensitivity to avoid transforming symbols into rigid dogmas. The journey of those who receive these fragments involves a balance between movement of the heart and examination of reason. Therefore, attentive reading should always ask, what practical impact does this have on my life and my community? What small, concrete decisions can I make now that align my daily life with the depth of these messages? Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. And as we continue, we'll go behind the scenes of the reactions, who applied these ideas in their own homes, what transformations emerged when families adopted basic practices suggested by the stories, and how researchers are trying to map the real-world impact of these messages on people's lives. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and to understand the true scope of the unrevealed messages. Nothing replaces hearing the voices of those who have lived the experience firsthand, and at the same time, listening to those who study them methodically and carefully. I begin with a testimony that many would classify as emotional, and it is because it tells the life of a person who decided to change because of words she heard, which, according to her, came from that forbidden fragment. I call her Anna, a pilgrim who traveled to Medjugorje in search of a sign for a personal crossroads. Anna describes the scene as if she still feels it. When I read that passage, I felt something like a light bulb went on inside me. It was a mixture of peace and urgency, a call to prioritize what truly matters. I returned home and that same month cut back on extra work hours to be more present with my children. We resumed praying before dinner and it changed our mindset about what is a priority. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a decision. It wasn't fear, it was transformation. There's a tone in her voice that mixes gratitude and surprise, and the story includes simple, concrete details. More family time, reconciliations, resumed prayer times that illustrate the practical impact that certain words can have when received. With faith and responsibility, this type of testimony serves as evidence of fruit. Someone found a new path, made decisions, and noticed an impact on their routine and relationships. For many, stories like Anna's are proof that there is, in fact, a transformative power in messages. They don't just remain at the level of ideas, but call for practices, changes in habits, and adjustments in mindset. Some speak of small sacrifices that yielded big gains. Less consumption for more presence, less digital distraction for more silence, less haste for more family dialogue. These gestures, when multiplied, can compose a collective change, and this is what some scholars of popular religiosity call a chain effect. Individual decisions generate community impact. But alongside this emotional and pastoral aspect lies a frontier of critical analysis that cannot be ignored. On the other side of the conversation is a theologian researcher, let's call him Dr. Carvalho, whose stance is investigative by principle. He recognizes the power of testimonies, but insists on the need for method. Subjective experience is valid and precious, but it does not replace documentary verification. When dealing with alleged revelations, we need to cross-reference sources, compare versions, understand who translated the text, in what context it was written, and how oral transmissions varied. Human memory is fragile. Emotional testimonies can be enhanced by the effect of community repercussions. Dr. Carvalho's critical eye points to real risks. The projection of desires and fears onto symbolic images, literalist readings that transform metaphors into inflexible dogmas, and the possibility of manipulation by agents who benefit from the mystery. Between emotional defense and critical analysis, important objections arise that deserve consideration. Some critics argue that fragmented circulation can fuel an alarmist mindset, creating hasty decisions based more on emotion than discernment. Others also point to the social vulnerability of communities that receive accounts like these during times of crisis. The search for meaning can make people susceptible to leaders who interpret and circulate the material according to their own agendas. Another point raised is that of textual authenticity. Without a clear chain of custody, without dated and signed copies, how can we claim that a text is identical to the one originally seen by the seers? These objections are not merely theoretical obstacles. They directly affect the integrity of the transmission process and the ethical impact of the circulation of revelations. In defense of the fragment and those who disseminate it, there is a pastoral response that does not ignore the reservations, but emphasizes the visible fruit. If a message provokes conversion, restoration of relationships, and choices that promote good, this is already an indicator to be taken into account, affirm pastors and theologians sensitive to the realm of religious experience. This defense does not minimize the need for investigation. On the contrary, it calls for academic analysis to go hand in hand with pastoral listening. The combination of method and human care is seen by many as the most honest path, validating transformation where it exists and simultaneously seeking sources, contexts, and verifications that avoid misinterpretations. In between these two poles, testimony and criticism are choices that are in themselves decisions worthy of examination. Some leaders chose to release portions of the material in controlled contexts, with reading guides and theological commentaries. Others preferred to archive documents and work with small study groups before any widespread dissemination. This variety of practices reflects different mindsets about responsibility and impact. Some favored immediate transparency, accepting the risk of controversy. Others prioritized prudence, fearing that an unprepared dissemination could do more harm than good. Each path has costs and gains, and the choice reveals priorities about which truths should be exposed and which should be allowed to mature. It's also important to consider the role of independent researchers who, in many cases, act as mediators between the world of devotees and academia. These professionals attempt to map the flow of documents, interview protagonists, and situate accounts within a broader historical framework. Some bring to light letters, diaries, and notes that illuminate nuances of the known versions. Others, upon finding discrepancies, propose hypotheses about edits, omissions, and collective memories. The presence of these researchers helps reveal the hidden truth, showing that hidden truth isn't always the result of malicious intent. It's often the result of a tangle of human factors: faulty memory, oral versions, pastoral decisions, and media priorities. By balancing emotion and method, we see that the central question is not just whether the fragment existed or not, but what we do with it, how we translate words into practice, and how we ensure that this translation respects lives and context. The personal transformation witnessed by many must be valued, just as the need for verification and care must be honored. This tension is productive when it drives us to act more responsibly, to make decisions that unite heart and reason, faith and discernment. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic. So, in the next few talks, we'll look at concrete cases of communities that implemented certain recommendations and studies that attempted to measure the practical results of these changes. We'll also hear more voices from families, leaders, and researchers to understand how revelations, even fragmented ones, impact the social fabric. Comment, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because talking about messages and visions is important, but what really matters is what this provokes in people's daily lives, in the concrete transformation of routines, in the decisions that shape families and communities. When we say that a fragment has the power to impact, we're not talking about a magical effect, but a process of cumulative change, small, intentionally repeated practices that, over time, reconfigure mindsets, priorities, and even the way each person exercises their faith. Thinking about the practical application of unrevealed messages is therefore taking ideas out of the realm of words and placing them in the realm of action. It's asking what simple, sustainable steps someone can take today so that the revelation doesn't just remain in their heads, but reaches their bodies and homes. Many stories we've gathered from communities that have tried to embrace parts of these messages describe a clear pattern. When someone decides to adjust a routine, cutting back on an attention-sapping habit, prioritizing family prayer, or redirecting spending toward acts of solidarity, they begin to notice ripple effects. This isn't a spectacular overnight transformation, but a maturation process where the hidden truth, when responsibly brought to light, has a real impact. This is called a journey, a series of small decisions that, when combined, generate profound repercussions. And so the practical question that arises is, what can I test now in a simple way to begin this change? One concrete action that many people report as transformative is setting aside a short but intentional daily time for silence and personal prayer. 10 minutes in the morning without cell phones, just to listen and organize the day. This simple gesture clears the mind and reorders priorities, helping to replace automatic reactions with conscious decisions. Another practice that frequently appears among families that have noticed an impact is re-establishing a daily meeting time at the table, however brief, where a prayer, a word of gratitude, and mutual attention are shared. This return to coexistence generates a new mindset about what is essential and reduces the distraction caused by hectic routines. And a third simple but powerful decision is to try a symbolic fast once a week. Not necessarily from food, but perhaps from social media or from time-consuming consumption, to rediscover inner space and hear more clearly what needs to be transformed. These three actions are not magic formulas. They are practical exercises that invite habit changes and, when repeated, create a new kind of spiritual discipline with a direct impact on domestic and community life. When we think of spiritual preparation in light of the messages, the central idea is not escape or panic, but responsibility. Preparing the heart, training the mind to listen, cultivating relationships that sustain faith. In practical terms, this means translating symbolic words into tangible gestures, resuming confession as a moment of sincere conversion, reinstituting small sacramental or devotional practices that strengthen the coherence between what is professed and what is lived, and creating spaces for family dialogue where priorities are discussed with tenderness and clarity. The impact of such choices is usually measured not in spectacular statistics, but in discrete signs. Fewer disagreements, more time shared, financial decisions that prioritize real needs, and gestures of solidarity that become routine. This is how a transformed mindset manifests itself, not as a spectacle, but as a persistence of good. It is essential, however, to combine usefulness with discernment. While promoting action, it is necessary to evaluate sources, contexts, and consequences. Not every practice suggested by a fragmented account is immediately applicable to every situation. Caring for the integrity of the community and the well-being of individuals should guide every decision. Therefore, a wise approach consists of testing changes on a small scale, observing results, adjusting when necessary, and sharing lessons learned with trusted leaders or study groups who can offer guidance. This responsible experimental method protects against impulsive reactions and transforms the search for revelations into a process of community maturation. The behind-the-scenes stories behind this application reveal intriguing insights. A parish that implemented a weekly family prayer time saw a subtle but solid increase in youth participation. A family that adopted a social media fast at mealtimes noticed improved parent-child dialogue. Small groups that meditated on specific passages reported concrete decisions to volunteer and support one another. These accounts form a mosaic of applied revelations, where the impact is not merely symbolic, but truly practical. A series of decisions that reshape the social fabric of faith. Observing these examples, it becomes clear that the transformation proposed by the Unrevealed messages has more to do with practice than theory. It is a change in habits that translates into presence, sacrifice, and service. At the same time, recognizing the potential for impact requires intellectual humility, understanding that interpreting symbols requires care, and that implementing practices must respect cultural, economic, and personal contexts. What works for one family may not be suitable for another. What helps one community may require adaptation in another context. Therefore, the call is always for an attitude of prudent experimentation, testing, evaluating, adjusting, and for open dialogue with those who follow spiritual life responsibly. This balance between action and evaluation is what transforms curiosity into sustainable change. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. Next, we'll follow real-life cases of families and communities that implemented some of these practices, and we'll see in detail which decisions had the greatest impact and why. We'll also explore how researchers and leaders are trying to measure this impact and what practical lessons are emerging from these studies and experiences. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and to truly map out what remains to be clarified about the so-called forbidden fragment. We need to list, without claiming easy answers, the open questions that underpin this entire investigation and invite everyone to reflect responsibly. First, who had access to the original fragment, and where is this document located today? This question is essential because every chain of custody defines credibility. When someone claims to have read something without providing a clear source, a gap opens up that fuels doubt and theory. Second, why wasn't there widespread news coverage of this specific excerpt? Was it a conscious editorial decision, institutional prudence, a lack of verifiable sources, or simple disinterest on the part of the press in the face of a complex subject? Understanding the press's motives helps separate silence out of caution from silence out of convenience. Third, are there different versions of the same fragment, and if so, who altered them and why? Small variations between transcripts can reveal a lot about human filters, intentional edits, or memory lapses that alter meaning and impact. Fourth, what is the chain of translation and interpretation of this material? Texts that travel between languages, regions, and cultures undergo adaptations. Understanding who translated what and at what point is part of the critical work that preserves the integrity of the content. Fifth, what role did local leaders and spiritual advisors play in the decision to publish, withhold, or reinterpret excerpts? Identifying actors and their motivations, pastoral, institutional, or even pragmatic, is crucial to mapping the behind-the-scenes nature of the circulation of this hidden truth. Other questions that touch on the essence of impact and responsibility follow. What documentary evidence supports the fragment's authenticity? Are there dated copies, recorded contemporary testimonies, letters, diaries, or official records that allow us to trace its origin? How have the memories of those who witnessed it changed over the years, and to what extent has this erosion affected the accuracy of the accounts? Another important gap is methodological. What academic studies or independent journalistic investigations have attempted to collate versions, and what conclusions have they drawn? Is there sociological research that has measured the practical effect of these messages on the communities that received them, measuring changes in mentality, family decisions, and social impact, or does everything remain anecdotal? If there are few studies, why does this area of research remain underexplored due to lack of interest, resources, access to archives, or the ethical complexity of the topic? We must also ask, who benefits from the silence or partial disclosure of these messages? In many information circulation processes, some actors gain visibility, authority, or even resources. Identifying potential conflicts of interest is part of the ethical work that prevents exploitation. At the same time, it is legitimate to ask, what real risks can arise from unfiltered disclosure, panic, community rupture, opportunistic leadership, and do these risks justify withholding information? The answer to this question requires a balance between transparency and prudence, and this can only be achieved through clear verification processes and pastoral care. Another under-answered dimension is that of the historical and geopolitical context. To what extent did the tensions of the time influence the media and institutional treatment of the apparitions and messages? Understanding historical factors helps interpret past decisions without reducing them to mere concealment. There are also practical questions about access and preservation. Where are the pilgrim archives? Which families kept notebooks with notes? Are there volunteers who digitized materials? And is there openness for researchers to examine these collections? Without access to primary archives, any reconstruction remains partial. This issue connects with a greater need, the creation of research protocols that respect pastoral sensitivity while also allowing for academic scrutiny, such as dating manuscripts, verifying versions, and recording interviews with testimonies. Another critical point is theological interpretation. Who offers a responsible hermeneutic for the symbolic images that appear in the fragment? Without qualified theological guidance, readings risk drifting toward alarmism or simplifications that lose the deeper meaning of the messages. Continuing with the questions, the topic of real impact emerges. What concrete decisions did communities make after accessing excerpts of these messages, and what were the practical results in terms of family cohesion, prayer practices, community engagement, and crisis responses? Are there documented examples of measurable transformations, or are emotional accounts predominant without systematic monitoring? And when transformations do occur, how were they evaluated beyond the initial enthusiasm? Another gap that requires investigation is that of circulation networks. Who reproduced the fragment in pamphlets, who shared it in private meetings, which parishes mentioned excerpts in catechesis, and how did these networks shape popular reception? Mapping these networks can reveal both intentions of care and paths of distortion. Furthermore, it is worth asking about institutional authority. What official stance has been adopted by bishops, ecclesiastical commissions, and review bodies regarding these fragments? Are there official documents, pastoral guidelines, or theological opinions that clarify the position and evaluation criteria? If they exist, why do they often remain unknown to the public? Institutional transparency is key to restoring trust in verification processes. Finally, a crucial question is ethical. How can we balance the right of the faithful to know messages that can inspire transformation with the obligation to protect communities from dangerous or manipulative interpretations? Answering this requires designing protocols that combine documentary research, theological discernment, and pastoral care. Answering these questions requires an interdisciplinary effort. Historians, theologians, sociologists, investigative journalists, and the community of believers themselves need to engage in dialogue. The investigation must be both technical and humane, because it's not just about proving or disproving, but about understanding real consequences, the impact on families, life decisions, changes in mindset, and community trajectories. This is where the public's role becomes crucial, reporting inconsistencies, sharing legitimate documents, and rigorously dated testimonies help build a clearer picture. At the same time, serious researchers must be alert to the pitfalls of collective memory and the temptation to transform gaps into conspiracy theories. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. And as we go along, we'll examine concrete ways to investigate these gaps, how to search archives, how to interview methodically, how to apply documentary verification tools, and how to foster a respectful dialogue between emotion and reason. This path is part of the journey for those who wish to get closer to the truth, without losing their responsibility for human lives and the real impact of revelations. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. And before we move on, let me summarize clearly. What we've seen so far reveals the importance of uniting heart and reason in receiving any revelation, and emphasizes that discernment is as essential as openness to the transformation these messages can provoke. In short, recognizing the emotional power of a story doesn't exempt us from the responsibility of verifying it and interpreting its propositions prudently. At the same time, excessive skepticism that ignores real fruits of conversion also impoverishes the ability to see signs of renewal. This balance between faith and method is, in itself, a central lesson, a kind of compass for those seeking truth and transformation without falling into the traps of sensationalism or closed-mindedness. By examining all the layers we've uncovered, the historical context of Medjugorje, the dynamics between those who protect and those who disseminate, the sensory images of the fragment and the reactions it provokes, we realize that we are not dealing with a simple document, but a living organism made up of people, memories, decisions, and consequences. The hidden truth many speak of is not just a textual enigma. It is a set of practical effects that spread through family routines, pastoral priorities, and individual choices. When a message prompts someone to reconnect with family, resume daily prayer, or adjust consumption habits, the immediate result may be subtle. A dinner where one speaks without distractions, a confession that restores a bond, a financial choice that prioritizes real needs, but the sum of these small decisions has a real impact, perceptible over time. Therefore, while documentary research is essential, the practical reading of the messages cannot be disregarded. Evaluating their fruits is a legitimate part of discernment. However, the search for clarity requires tools. Good intentions are not enough. Protocol and method are needed. Dating manuscripts, comparing versions, interviewing witnesses with records, mapping chains of custody, and contextualizing each passage within the historical circumstances in which it was transmitted. This work also needs to be done with pastoral sensitivity, because behind every document lie real lives, fragile communities, and memories that can be reactivated by reckless disclosure. Responsible research, therefore, combines technique and humanity, rigor in verification and care in managing the effects on people and communities. This is the responsibility of those who study and those who, in turn, decide to disseminate. When reflecting on mindset and decisions, it's worth remembering that the mere existence of a fragment that provokes transformation does not warrant automatic interpretations or prophetic panic. Sensible interpretation requires qualified hermeneutics, theologians who know how to dialogue with history experts, sociologists who analyze community impacts, journalists who verify sources, and pastoral leaders who guide practical applications. Only in this way can we avoid two dangerous illusions, that of uncritical acceptance that transforms everything into dogma, and that of systematic rejection that disqualifies all genuine spiritual experience. Between these extremes lies the path of collective discernment, where the community participates, questions, and matures, and where relevant decisions, for example, adopting practices suggested by messages or releasing a sensitive document, are subject to deliberative and respectful processes. When thinking about impact, it's helpful to distinguish between intimate transformation and social consequences. Intimate transformation manifests itself in personal choices, returning to prayer, prioritizing family, adopting a discipline of fasting, or limiting distractions, and these changes, when multiplied, lead to tangible social changes. Greater community cohesion, more charitable initiatives strengthen support networks. On the other hand, the disorderly circulation of fragments without verification can generate the opposite effect: confusion, division, and authoritarian leaderships that exploit the mystery. Therefore, the guiding question must always be twofold. What concrete impact do we want to promote by exposing a message? And what preventive measures will we adopt to minimize harm and distorted interpretations? From what was gathered, we also realize the relevance of the behind-the-scenes, pilgrim archives, letters between visionaries and counselors, records of public and private confessions, and even the silent role of communities that preserved notebooks and memoirs. These behind-the-scenes stories are often where truth is preserved, but also where it can undergo alterations through forgetfulness, adaptation, or intention. Understanding these mechanisms requires investigative patience and an ethical commitment to preserving sources. For those seeking hidden truth, the path lies in building bridges between the archive and life, between study and practice, between the written word and concrete action. In practical terms, this leads us to a posture that combines curiosity and responsibility. Curiosity to investigate open questions with intellectual honesty. Responsibility to care for the well-being of those affected by the revelations. These two attitudes are not opposed. On the contrary, they are complementary and necessary for the investigation to bear true fruit. This is how a community can transform the sense of mystery into an opportunity for growth, instead of allowing the forbidden fragment to become ammunition for conflict or a source of despair. Allowing the investigation to advance with sensitivity is also an act of care for the social fabric of faith. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and the next step is to delve into the documents, hear more voices from those who experience the practical consequences, and methodically examine the evidence that can shed light on the gaps. There are concrete stories, files, and decisions waiting to be confronted with serious verification criteria, and it is at this point that the investigation takes shape and becomes responsible. However, before we move forward, I want to hear from you. Which of these questions worries you most right now? Comment below. This makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking with me through these questions and revelations, knowing there are people willing to think carefully and with heart gives meaning to this work. If this content was helpful and you want to follow more investigations and reflections on prophecy, transformation, and the behind-the-scenes of faith, subscribe to the channel. I promise to bring well-done research, diverse voices, and material that will help you in your daily spiritual decisions. If something touched you right now, leave the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," in the comments. I'll read and apply these answers to future episodes. knowing you are here changes the direction of our research. And if this conversation resonated, leave a like. It's a simple gesture that shows we're connected and that it's worth moving forward with care and responsibility. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. There are more documents and testimonies waiting to be examined together. Thank you for being here. We continue this journey with attention and courage.